In March 1975, two sisters walked out of a suburban shopping mall on a quiet spring afternoon and never made it home. For decades, their disappearance lingered as an unanswered question, spoken about in lowered voices across Maryland neighborhoods. Then, more than 40 years later, investigators reopened old files and uncovered overlooked details. What those findings would reveal would finally begin to explain what happened to them, why the truth took so long to surface. Kensington, Maryland, in the mid-1970s, moved at an unhurried pace, especially on weekday afternoons. Streets curved through quiet neighborhoods where maple trees cast wide shadows across sidewalks, and the sound of lawnmowers drifted lazily from yard to yard. Children passed one another on bicycles, calling out names without stopping, confident they would cross paths again before dinner. The Lyon house on Pliers Mill Road felt lived in, active, and familiar. A radio played softly in the background most mornings, its voice steady and recognizable. John Lyon's voice was known across the region, but inside the house it blended into the rhythm of daily life. News segments interrupted by the clink of coffee mugs, music fading beneath conversations at the breakfast table. Mary Lyon stood at the counter, rinsing dishes, watching her daughters move through the kitchen. Sheila leaned against a chair, flipping through a magazine, while Katherine sat cross-legged on the floor, tying and retying the laces of her sneakers, even though they were already secure. "When is Dad taking us out?" Katherine asked, tilting her head back to look up at her mother. "Soon," Mary said, glancing at the calendar pinned to the wall. "Your birthdays are coming up. We'll make it special." Sheila smiled. "You said that last year." "Oh, and I meant it last year too," Mary replied, amused. "Didn't I?" The girls exchanged a look. Katherine shrugged. It was pretty good. Both girls had been counting down the days. Sheila was on the edge of turning 13, eager for the sense of independence that came with it. Katherine followed closely behind, watching everything her older sister did, absorbing tone and confidence alike. They were different in temperament, but inseparable in motion, always drifting back toward one another. March 25th arrived quietly. It was the second day of spring break, and there was no alarm clock pulling anyone out of bed. Sunlight crept across the living room carpet as the house slowly woke up. By the time breakfast ended, the boys were already grabbing a basketball. "We're going to the court," Jay said, reaching for the door. "Be back before dinner," Mary called after them. When Katherine and Sheila mentioned heading to Wheaton Plaza, Mary paused just long enough to consider it. The shopping center was close, familiar, and filled with people they knew. "Why don't you stop off and get some pizza while you're there?" she suggested. Katherine's face lit up. "At the Orange Bowl? If that's where you want," Mary said. "They raised the price again," Katherine added, shaking her head dramatically. "It's 45 cents now." Sheila laughed. "You still have enough." Each girl counted her money, $2 folded neatly, checked twice. Jackets were pulled on, hair brushed quickly, not carefully. Mary looked up from the counter. "Be home by 4, she said. "We will," Sheila replied without hesitation. "Promise." "We promise," Katherine echoed. The front door closed behind them just before midday, their voices fading as they walked down the path toward the street. Mary watched from the window for a moment, then turned back to what she had been doing. Later, John drove Mary to a nearby bowling alley after a friend suggested they go. He had worked overnight and moved through the afternoon with the slightly slowed rhythm of someone running on little sleep. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay home?" he asked as he grabbed his keys. "They'll be fine," Mary said. "They're just going to the plaza." Oh, the Wheaton Plaza shopping center carried its usual hum that afternoon. Cars rolled through the lot, doors opening and closing in steady succession. Inside, the air smelled faintly of popcorn, cleaning solution, and warm food. The Orange Bowl pizza parlor buzzed with activity, children lining up, trays sliding across counters, laughter spilling out toward the walkway. Katherine and Sheila joined the crowd easily. At one point, a neighborhood boy recognized them sitting outside, talking with other kids nearby. "Hey," he said, waving. "What are you guys doing?" "Just hanging out," Sheila replied. Inside the pizza place, Jay Lyon spotted his sisters while buying a kite. They sat together at a table, eating, talking quietly. He considered stopping, then decided against it. "I'll see you at home," he said later when asked. By mid-afternoon, shadows stretched longer across the pavement. A friend saw Katherine and Sheila leaving the shopping center, heading in the direction of their house. They walked side by side, unhurried, familiar with every step of the route. Back home, Mary Lyon set to work on dinner. The smell of oil heating in the pan filled the kitchen, the sound of sizzling beginning softly. She checked the clock. 4 o'clock. She waited a few minutes, wiping her hands on a towel, listening for the door. When nothing happened, she frowned slightly. They're probably talking, she said to herself. Another glance at the clock. More time passed. Mary stepped into the hallway and looked toward the front door, then back at the stove. The irritation she felt at first didn't last long. Something else crept in, quieter but heavier, settling in her chest. She turned the radio down. The house felt too still. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Wheaton Plaza shopping center had settled into its daily rhythm. The lunch crowd was thinning but not gone, and the steady movement of people gave the space a low, constant hum. Car doors opened and closed in the parking lot. Shopping bags brushed against legs. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed sharply, the sound cutting through the general noise before dissolving back into it. Outside the Orange Bowl pizza parlor, a metal bench ran parallel to the walkway. Grease-spotted paper plates were stacked on a nearby trash can, and the smell of warm dough and tomato sauce lingered in the air, heavier, closer to the entrance. Katherine and Sheila Lyon sat together on the bench, facing outward toward the passing crowd. Katherine leaned back slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the seat on either side of her. Her legs swung forward and back in an easy rhythm, the rubber soles of her sneakers brushing against the bench frame. Sheila sat more upright, her attention divided between her sister and the people moving past them, occasionally adjusting the strap of her jacket on her shoulder. A man stopped several feet in front of them. He positioned himself carefully, not blocking the walkway, not forcing anyone to stop. His brown suit looked deliberate in a place where most adults wore casual clothes. The fabric was smooth, the crease sharp. His shoes were clean. In his right hand, he held a small microphone. A thin cord ran from it into a dark briefcase, resting on the ground beside his foot. "Can I get a couple of voices for a recording?" he asked, his tone even, polite, practiced. A few children nearby turned toward him. No one stepped away. "I work with audio," he continued, lifting the microphone slightly so it caught the light. "Sometimes these go on the radio." One child leaned forward, curiosity winning out. "Really?" The man nodded. "Just say your name, that's all." And his scroll, the microphone passed from hand to hand. Each child spoke briefly, some whispering, others louder than necessary. A few laughed when they heard the faint echo from the device. The man responded the same way each time: small nod, polite smile, careful adjustment of the cord leading back to the briefcase. Katherine watched closely, her eyes following the movement of the microphone. "Do you really play them on the radio?" she asked. "Sometimes," the man replied. "People like hearing themselves." Sheila hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward. "I'm Sheila," she said, her voice steady but slightly higher than usual. The man held the microphone a little closer. "Thank you." Katherine followed immediately, speaking quickly, almost tripping over her words. When she finished, she laughed and leaned back, nudging Sheila's arm. "That was weird," she said. The man smiled again, already turning slightly as another child stepped forward. A neighborhood boy who knew the Lyon sisters stood a short distance away, watching. He noticed how the man never opened the briefcase, never showed what was inside it, only adjusted the cord as if everything necessary was already there. At the time, it registered only as unusual, not alarming. After a few minutes, the group began to thin. Children drifted away towards stores or parents. Katherine pushed herself up from the bench. "Let's eat," she said. Inside the Orange Bowl, the temperature rose noticeably. The air felt thicker, filled with the smell of melted cheese and hot oil. Workers moved quickly behind the counter, sliding trays forward, calling out numbers. Katherine and Sheila ordered without hesitation and found a small table near the wall. They talked while they ate, their voices low, leaning slightly toward each other over the table. Outside the window, people passed by in a steady stream. Around 2 o'clock, the door opened and Jay Lyon stepped inside. He paused just long enough to scan the room before spotting his sisters. "There you are," he said, stopping beside their table. "We're almost done," Sheila said, lifting her slice slightly. "Mom said 4, Katherine added. Jay nodded. "I'll see you at home." He didn't sit down. He didn't look around. He turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Outside again, the bench stood empty. A short distance away, near the edge of the walkway, a young man lingered. He stood with his weight shifted onto one leg, his posture loose but unmoving. His hair fell past his ears, uneven, and his jacket looked worn, lighter in color, its fabric creased from use. Danette Shea noticed him almost immediately. "He keeps looking at us," she said quietly to her friend, leaning closer. The young man didn't look away when one of the girls turned toward him. "Why don't you take a picture?" she called out. "It'll last longer." The words landed sharply. The young man said nothing. He took a few steps back, putting more space between himself and the group, but he didn't leave. A few minutes later, Katherine and Sheila stepped back outside, brushing their hands together to remove crumbs. The man with the microphone was gone. The younger man was no longer visible along the walkway. "Ready?" Sheila asked. Katherine nodded. Sometime between 2:30 and 3, a friend saw the sisters walking away from the shopping center. They moved west, along the familiar route toward home. Their pace was even. They walked close together, talking, their heads occasionally turning toward each other as they spoke. At 4 o'clock, Mary Lyon checked the clock in the kitchen. "They should be here," she said, mostly to herself. She continued cooking, listening for the sound of the front door. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. She turned the burner down and wiped her hands on a towel. "They're late," she said when John came into the room. "They probably stopped somewhere," he replied, without looking concerned. By 5:45, the smell of fried chicken filled the house. Mary stood still for a moment, then walked to the front window and looked out at the street. Nothing moved. At 7 o'clock, she picked up the phone. "My daughters didn't come home," she said, her voice tightening as she spoke. Police arrived soon after. Questions came quickly. Clothing, money, route. Officers wrote steadily, nodding as Mary answered. Search dogs later traced a path from the shopping center toward the edge of a parking lot, then stopped. "That's it," the handler said quietly. As night settled in, flashlights cut across the ground. Volunteers gathered, radios crackled. Then the phone rang. "I have your daughters," a man said calmly. John Lyon listened without speaking, his grip tightening around the receiver as instructions were given. Later, the briefcase sat untouched. The phone rang again. "There were too many police," the voice said. John answered without raising his voice. "I need to hear my daughters." The line went silent, and it never rang again. The first police cars arrived on Pliers Mill Road just after 7 in the evening, their headlights sweeping across the front of the Lyon house before coming to rest, the light briefly illuminating the edges of the lawn and the front windows where the curtains had already been drawn halfway closed. The red and blue lights did not yet flash urgently. Instead, they pulsed at a steady, almost restrained rhythm, reflecting faintly off the siding and giving the scene the uneasy feeling of something still unfolding, not yet fully understood. Inside the house, 2 officers stood several feet apart, one near the doorway with a notebook already open, the other moving slowly through the living room, as though trying to absorb the space as much as the words being spoken. Mary Lyon sat upright on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap, her posture rigid not from panic but from effort, as though she were holding herself together by force of will alone. "They were supposed to be home by 4, she said, explaining the day again from the beginning, her voice steady but moving quickly, every detail delivered with precision, as if accuracy itself might somehow matter. "They left late morning, just before noon. They said they were going to the plaza. They've walked there before. It's close." John Lyon stood near the fireplace, arms folded across his chest, shifting his weight slightly from one foot to the other as the officer asked follow-up questions, writing down times, locations, clothing, money carried. When asked whether the girls had ever stayed out late without calling, John shook his head without hesitation. "They know better than that," he said. "They would have called." Well, within minutes, the response widened. Calls were placed to Wheaton Plaza. Additional units were dispatched. Officers began knocking on doors up and down the block, repeating the same questions in slightly different ways, watching faces closely for any reaction that lingered a moment too long. At the shopping center, the tone shifted quickly from casual inquiry to focused procedure as officers moved from store to store, speaking with clerks, managers, and security guards, asking who had been working that afternoon, who had been outside, who might remember seeing two girls matching the descriptions being read aloud. Every answer was written down, every time estimate compared against the next. Search and rescue teams arrived as daylight faded, unloading equipment from vans parked along the edges of the lot, the metallic clatter of gear echoing briefly in the open space. Dogs were brought out, their handlers crouching beside them, hands resting firmly at the base of their collars as quiet instructions were given. When released, the dogs moved with purpose, noses low, tracing a path from the plaza outward, following it steadily along the perimeter of the parking area until, near the edge of a department store lot, their movement slowed and then stopped altogether. "That's where it ends," one handler said, straightening slowly as the dog lifted its head, uncertain. Flashlights cut thin beams across the ground as officers and volunteers searched dumpsters, storm drains, and patches of brush, calling the girls' names into the dark in voices that grew hoarser with each repetition. Cars idled nearby, radios crackling softly as information was exchanged, updated, corrected. Back at the Lyon house, the phone rang almost constantly. Some callers offered sympathy, their voices tentative and unsure of what to say. Others claimed to have seen the girls hours earlier, or miles away, or somewhere that made no sense at all. Each call was logged, every detail written down, no matter how small. Then the phone rang again, and this time the voice on the other end was different. "I have your daughters," the man said, calmly, without raising his voice or rushing his words. John Lyon did not respond immediately. He held the receiver slightly away from his ear and looked toward the officers in the room, one of whom stepped closer, listening intently. When John spoke, his voice remained controlled, the effort behind it invisible but unmistakable. "What do you want?" he asked. The instructions came quickly, delivered without hesitation. A briefcase, $10,000, a specific restroom in an Annapolis courthouse. Police intervened quietly, instructing John to comply with the directions but altering the contents of the briefcase, placing only a small amount of money inside while arranging for officers to observe from a distance. Late that night, John drove alone to the courthouse, carrying the briefcase exactly as instructed, his movements deliberate, his focus fixed on following each step precisely. He placed the case where he had been told and left without looking back. The briefcase was never taken. The following day, the phone rang again. "There were too many police," the same voice said. "I couldn't get it." John did not raise his voice. He did not hesitate. "If you want me to do anything else," he said, "I need to hear my daughters." The line went silent. That voice never called again. By the next morning, investigators had reached a clear conclusion. The girls had not left on their own. The scope of the search expanded accordingly, with house-to-house canvassing intensified, helicopters brought in to survey nearby wooded areas, and scuba teams dispatched to check ponds, drainage systems, and bodies of water that lay within a widening radius. A reward was announced. Flyers were printed and distributed across neighborhoods and shopping centers. Katherine and Sheila's faces appeared on television screens, accompanied by carefully chosen words asking for information. Witnesses began to come forward in greater numbers. One boy described seeing the sisters outside the Orange Bowl speaking with an older man carrying a microphone and a briefcase, neatly dressed, his manner confident enough to draw children toward him. Investigators listened closely, asking follow-up questions, noting details that repeated across accounts. Composite sketches were commissioned. Witnesses sat with artists, focusing intently as questions narrowed in on specific features. The shape of the nose, the line of the jaw, the way the man stood. When the sketches were finished, they were circulated widely, the figure quickly gaining a nickname among investigators, the tape recorder man. Another witness offered a different description entirely. A younger man, long hair, intense staring, a light-colored jacket, His composite looked nothing like the first. Investigators discussed the discrepancy at length, weighing possibilities, ultimately directing most of their attention toward the older figure who appeared in multiple accounts. Tips flooded in. Some were detailed, others vague, many contradictory. An 11-year-old boy reported seeing two girls resembling the Lyons inside a white two-door car traveling through Virginia, insisting that one of them appeared distressed. The sighting was treated cautiously but taken seriously enough to expand the search area. Another witness claimed to have seen two girls in the back of a station wagon later that same evening, the driver resembling the composite sketch. A partial license plate was recalled. Volunteers mobilized on CB radios, scanning highways, calling out movements in real time. No vehicle was ever located. Days turned into weeks. The intensity of the search did not disappear, but it began to settle into routine. Inside the Lyon house, life reorganized itself around absence, with someone always near the phone, meals prepared and left untouched, birthdays passing quietly without the celebration that had been promised. Then, on the day after the first composite sketch was released, an 18-year-old man walked into Wheaton Plaza and approached a security guard. "I need to talk to the police," he said. "I saw something." His name was Lloyd Lee Welch, Jr. He claimed he had been at the shopping center on the day the girls disappeared, that he had seen them speaking with the man carrying the microphone, and that he had witnessed that man forcing the girls into a red car before driving away. Welch was taken to a nearby station, where he provided a lengthy statement and agreed to a polygraph test. When the results came back indicating deception, investigators confronted him. Welch admitted he had lied. No clear motive was offered. The possibility of attention-seeking or interest in the reward was noted. A single page was placed on top of his statement. Written across it were two words: "Polygraph lied." The file was closed, and the investigation moved on. By the time summer arrived, the pace of the search had changed, not because anyone formally declared it over, but because the days themselves began to stack on top of one another without bringing anything new. Patrol cars still drove through the neighborhood. Detectives still reviewed tips as they came in, but the urgency that had once defined every hour slowly gave way to a quieter, heavier routine, one shaped more by endurance than momentum. Inside the Lyon house, time reorganized itself around absence. Someone was always within reach of the telephone, close enough to hear it ring from any room. Mary Lyon slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, her mind running through possibilities before she was fully conscious. John returned to work, his familiar radio voice continuing to reach listeners each morning, even as the space at home remained unchanged. Bedrooms left exactly as they had been. The birthdays passed without ceremony. The promised celebration was never mentioned aloud, but it lingered in the air, unspoken, like a sentence left unfinished. Friends and neighbors tried to help in the ways they knew how, dropping off meals, stopping by briefly, offering words that felt insufficient the moment they were spoken. For investigators, the case never closed, but it slowed. Tips continued to arrive, dozens each year, each one logged, evaluated, and either pursued or quietly set aside. Some callers were convinced they had seen the girls years earlier, now older, now different, now somewhere far away. Others offered theories that shifted with time, adapting to whatever details happened to resurface in the news. The composite sketches remained pinned to bulletin boards and tucked into case files, their faces becoming familiar to officers who had never met the girls themselves. The tape recorder man remained the primary figure of interest, his image resurfacing periodically whenever a new lead appeared, only to fade again when nothing came of it. In the early 1980s, another name briefly drew attention, a man with a known history of targeting children whose methods involved approaching them with harmless-seeming devices, became a focus after his arrest for unrelated crimes. Investigators traced his movements, noting that he had been in the general area around the time of the Lyon sisters' disappearance. Interviews were conducted, records were pulled. Ultimately, nothing connected him definitively to the case, and the focus shifted once again. Years passed. Detectives retired. Others transferred. New officers inherited the file, reading through thousands of pages detailing searches they had not been part of, decisions they had not made. The case became one of many, referenced occasionally, never forgotten, but rarely advancing. Within the Lyon family, the passage of time did not bring resolution, only a gradual adjustment to living without answers. The question of what had happened never stopped being present, but it changed shape, becoming less acute and more constant. A quiet weight carried into every ordinary moment. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, advances in forensic science began to transform the way older cases were viewed. Cold case units emerged. Long dormant files were reopened elsewhere, sometimes yielding results no one had expected. Periodically, the Lyon case was reviewed again, its details re-examined with fresh eyes, though each review ended the same way, with no physical evidence to test, no definitive location to search. Still, the file remained intact. Then, in 2013, a decision was made to review the case in its entirety, not as a routine update, but as a comprehensive re-examination. Every document preserved from the original investigation was pulled from storage, stacked in sequence, and read again from the beginning. Sergeant Chris Homrock approached the task methodically. He did not skim. He did not jump ahead to the familiar names. He started where the investigation itself had started, moving page by page, statement by statement, paying attention not just to what was emphasized, but to what had been dismissed. As the hours passed, patterns began to emerge, witnesses whose descriptions overlapped in subtle ways, timelines that aligned more closely than previously assumed. Then, buried among the early reports, he came across a statement that had been written down and set aside decades earlier. The name was Lloyd Lee Welch, Jr. The report detailed a young man who had come forward in the first week, who had claimed to witness the abduction itself, and who had failed a polygraph test soon after. Across the top of the file, in plain handwriting, were the words that had effectively ended his relevance to the investigation. Polygraph lied. Homrock paused. He did not stop because the statement was convincing it wasn't, but because something about it felt unfinished. Welch had known details that aligned too closely with what other witnesses had said, even if his account itself had not held up under scrutiny. Homrock pulled additional records tied to the name. Arrests, charges, mugshots. One photograph, taken in 1977 in connection with a burglary arrest, caught his attention. The face staring back from the image bore a striking resemblance to one of the composite sketches that had received far less attention than the other. The sketch of the younger man witnesses had described lingering and staring inside the shopping center. The resemblance was difficult to dismiss. Welch, Homrock learned, had not disappeared after 1975. He had accumulated a long criminal history, including offenses involving violence and the targeting of children. At the time of the review, Welch was serving a lengthy sentence in a Delaware correctional facility. Homrock sat back, the file open in front of him. The case, dormant for decades, had not changed, but the context around it had. The decision to speak with Lloyd Lee Welch, Jr. was not announced publicly, nor treated as a dramatic turning point within the department. It was simply logged, approved, and scheduled, one step among many, in a methodical review process that had begun months earlier. Arrangements were made quietly, paperwork filed, and on an October morning in 2013, 2 detectives traveled to the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center in Delaware to conduct the interview. Welch had been incarcerated for years by that point, his routine fixed, his movements predictable. When investigators entered the interview room, he was already seated at the table, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely in front of him. He did not ask why they were there. "I know why you're here," he said instead, looking up as they took their seats. "You're here about those 2 missing kids." The room was quiet except for the low hum of the facility around them. One of the detectives placed a photograph on the table between them, sliding it forward deliberately. "These 2 girls," he said. "They were never found. Their parents are nearly 80 years old. They don't know what happened. That's why we're here." Welch leaned forward, studying the image without touching it. He did not deny recognizing the girls. He began talking almost immediately, his voice steady, his tone conversational, as though recounting something he had already rehearsed many times. At first, he described himself as a bystander, someone who had noticed the girls near the shopping center on the day they disappeared. Nothing more. Then, his account shifted slightly. He spoke of seeing a man with 2 girls near a car, saying the situation didn't look right, adding that one of the girls appeared upset. When shown a photograph of a known offender investigators had previously considered, Welch identified the man as the person he believed was responsible. "He did it," Welch said flatly. "He took them." When asked what he believed had happened afterward, Welch shrugged. "My opinion? He hurt them. Probably tried to get rid of everything." The interview stretched on for hours, Welch's story evolving in small but noticeable ways as detectives asked precise follow-up questions. Details emerged that had not been prompted, descriptions that aligned too closely with known elements of the case to be coincidence. At the same time, his account contradicted itself repeatedly, forcing investigators to slow the conversation, circling back, pressing him to clarify. In a subsequent interview, Welch's version changed again. This time, he claimed he had followed the girls as they left the shopping center, that he had known the man he previously blamed, and that the girls had been taken to a residence. He spoke of watching events unfold from outside, of hearing one of the girls cry out, of leaving quickly without intervening. Each version placed Welch closer to the center of events, even as he continued to deny direct responsibility. Investigators documented every shift carefully, noting not just what changed, but when it changed, and what questions had preceded each revision. As interviews continued over the following months, Welch's accounts began to implicate members of his own family. He spoke of his father, then his uncle. He described a basement, concrete walls, a single rear entrance secured from the outside, a space he said was rarely used and never discussed openly. He claimed that the girls had been brought there and that he had witnessed parts of what followed, leaving before it ended. At times, Welch denied these claims entirely, retracting statements made only weeks earlier. At other moments, he offered new details without being asked, correcting himself mid-sentence, revising timelines, assigning roles differently each time. The pattern itself became significant. Investigators requested permission to search locations, Welch described. In September 2014, teams arrived at a residence in Hyattsville, Maryland, associated with Welch's family. The layout matched his descriptions closely enough to warrant further attention. Items were seized, samples collected. A separate search took place hundreds of miles away, on family-owned land in Bedford County, Virginia, near a place known locally as Taylor's Mountain. Neighbors had long remembered a large fire there decades earlier, one that burned for days, producing an unusual smell but raising no alarm at the time. Federal evidence recovery specialists assisted in the search. Soil was sifted carefully. Small fragments were collected, cataloged, and sent for analysis. Among the items recovered were degraded bone fragments of human origin, a single human tooth, a length of charred wire consistent with eyewear, and remnants of a beaded accessory resembling something one of the girls was known to wear. The condition of the remains limited what testing could be done. The tooth was lost before analysis could be completed. The fragments were too degraded for identification. Still, the findings mattered. As the investigation expanded, additional family members were interviewed. Welch's cousin described meeting him at the Virginia property in the spring of 1975, helping unload heavy duffel bags from his vehicle, noticing the smell, assisting in disposing of them without asking questions. Another relative recalled being asked to wash clothing stained dark red, a request she refused. These accounts, independent of one another, aligned with locations and timelines Welch had described, even as his own statements continued to shift. Forensic testing conducted at Welch's father's former residence revealed extensive traces of blood throughout the rear basement room. From floor to ceiling, evidence of an event that had occurred long before the house changed hands. The samples were human in origin, though too degraded to identify further. By early 2015, investigators concluded they had reached a threshold. Welch's statements, despite their inconsistencies, were corroborated in part by physical findings and family testimony. His knowledge of the case exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to an outside observer. In July, a grand jury returned indictments charging Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the disappearance of Katherine and Sheila Lyon. At a press conference announcing the charges, officials stated plainly that the girls had been harmed and that their deaths had occurred in the course of their abduction. Other individuals were named as persons of interest, but no additional charges were filed. Welch was transferred to face prosecution. In court filings, he admitted to participating in the abduction, maintaining his denial of causing the deaths themselves. Negotiations followed, shaped in part by the wishes of the Lyon family, who sought resolution without prolonging the process further. On a September morning in 2017, Welch stood before a judge and entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He spoke only to confirm his plea. When offered the opportunity to address the family, he declined. The sentence was announced: 2 concurrent 48-year terms. The room remained silent as the words settled. The courtroom was quiet in the way rooms become quiet only after everyone inside already understands what is coming. The air felt heavy, unmoving, as if the space itself resisted any sound that might disturb the moment. Katherine and Sheila Lyon's parents sat side by side, their posture upright, their expressions composed not because the moment was easy, but because they had learned, over decades, how to endure long stretches of uncertainty without breaking apart. When Lloyd Lee Welch, Jr. stood to enter his plea, he did so without hesitation, his movements controlled, his voice flat as he confirmed the words required of him. He acknowledged his role in the events that had taken the girls from their family, even as he continued to avoid certain specifics, drawing lines that no longer carried the power to change the outcome. When the judge offered him the opportunity to address the family directly, Welch declined, remaining silent, his gaze fixed forward. The sentence, 2 concurrent 48-year terms, was delivered without embellishment. There was no visible reaction from Welch as the words settled into the room. For the Lyon family, the sound carried a different weight. It did not bring relief in the way people often imagine closure arriving, but it did bring something solid, something final enough to stand on after years spent suspended between hope and resignation. Outside the courtroom, statements were brief. Gratitude was expressed toward investigators who had refused to let the case disappear entirely, even as it aged beyond what most people believed could ever be resolved. There were no declarations of victory, no claims that justice had fully arrived. The tone was measured, careful, shaped by the understanding that nothing said aloud could restore what had been lost. In the months and years that followed, life did not return to what it had been before 1975, because that version of life no longer existed. Instead, a different rhythm emerged, one shaped by long memory and quiet persistence. Katherine and Sheila's names remained spoken within the family, not as symbols or headlines, but as daughters and sisters whose absence had shaped every chapter that followed. Within law enforcement circles, the case took on a different kind of significance. It stood as an example of what sustained attention, even when sporadic, could eventually uncover. Detectives spoke of the importance of revisiting early assumptions, of reading old files without accepting previous conclusions as permanent. The conviction, achieved without the recovery of complete remains, marked one of the longest intervals between a crime and a successful prosecution of its kind. Still, unanswered questions remained. The precise sequence of events following the girls' departure from the shopping center was never fully reconstructed. The roles of others named over the years were never resolved through charges or trials. Physical evidence, degraded by time and circumstance, offered only partial confirmation, never the certainty that comes with definitive identification. For the Lyon family, these gaps were not new. They had lived with them for decades, learning to carry the weight of what could not be known alongside what finally had been acknowledged. The legal conclusion did not erase the years spent waiting by the phone, the birthdays marked only by memory, the ordinary days that had unfolded under the quiet pressure of a question that never fully released its grip. In the wider community, the case continued to occupy a particular place in collective memory. It had begun as a disruption to a sense of safety many people did not realize they relied upon until it was gone. Over time, it became a reminder that familiarity does not guarantee protection, and that danger does not always announce itself in ways that are easy to recognize. As years passed, the details faded for some, sharpened for others. What remained constant was the image of 2 sisters walking together on a spring afternoon, their plans simple, their expectations ordinary. That image endured not because it represented loss alone, but because it captured a moment before everything changed, a moment that refused to be reduced to a single explanation. In January 2025, Lloyd Lee Welch, Jr. was transferred to begin serving his sentence in Virginia, a procedural step that attracted little public attention. By then, the case had moved out of the news cycle, replaced by newer stories, newer tragedies, newer demands for attention. For the Lyon family, however, time did not measure importance in headlines. The case remained part of daily life, present even in its quietest moments. What lingered most was not the crime itself, but the endurance of those left behind. The parents who had never stopped answering the phone, even when years passed without it ringing for the reason they hoped. The investigators who returned to old pages not because they expected certainty, but because uncertainty deserved another look. The community that learned, slowly and painfully, that vigilance cannot be outsourced entirely to assumptions of safety. The story of Katherine and Sheila Lyon did not end with a discovery that answered every question. It ended with an acknowledgement, written into the record, that what happened mattered, that time did not erase responsibility, and that attention, even delayed, could still carry consequences. And so the case settled into its final shape not as a solved mystery in the traditional sense, but as a reminder that some truths emerge only after long patience, and that even then, they arrive incomplete, shaped as much by what remains unknown as by what is finally named. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on the lives at the center of it, not just the outcome. Sharing this video helps keep their names remembered and supports the work of those who continue searching for answers long after the headlines fade. Thank you for watching and for choosing to listen with care.